Hi, this is Cindy Rushton. Welcome to another Mom to Mom radio show. I am so glad that you have joined us today. Today we have a very special treat. You see, I will be welcoming my internet pal, Cynthia Hancox, all the way from New Zealand. She is going to share her awesome testimony of what God has done to bring her healing and deliverance along her life journey. You are in for a huge treat. I don't know that words can fully express how excited I am about this particular message. You see, I myself battled with depression. We've struggled through hard times financially. We have also gone through some of those valleys and not knowing whether God would really deliver us either. And hearing Cynthia's testimony just presses me back into the heart of God, and she also helps me to be able to take a real inventory of all of God's goodness in my journey. I think you're going to find it to be the same way for you. Well, just a brief introduction. Cynthia has been married to her sweetheart, Rob, for 17 years. She's a homeschooling mom of Chris, who is 15, Samantha, who is 13, Ben, who is 11, Sarah, who is 9, Rebecca, who is 7. I'm just going to turn the mic over to Cynthia and just let her pour forth from her heart to yours. I just think this will bless you over and over again. In fact, I would almost promise that you'll want to pass this one on to your friends too. Well, without any further ado, I just want to welcome you, Cynthia, and tell you how happy I am that you have joined us here at Mom to Mom Radio Show.
Hi Cindy. Well, I'm just really excited to be here today and to share part of our testimony. You know, this all started when I was listening to Cindy's Oops, My Cup is Empty and My Coffee Pot is Broken Bible study, and I wanted to be able to share some of my experiences with depression because that seemed quite relevant to the study. Because of my slow connection speed, I couldn't really enter into the study and share there, so I wrote out my testimony about depression and sent it to Cindy, and she wanted to record it. I also sent her some of our testimony of the awesome things God has done in our life, getting us out of debt and other things, and she thought we could put them together. And at first I just didn't see how. But as I was listening to last week's Oops study, suddenly all the light bulbs went on and I could just see the connection. You see, life isn't just about good things. There's ups and there's downs, even for Christians. Sometimes we think that when life is going really badly and things are difficult, that somehow it's our fault, somehow it's not normal for a Christian to experience those things. Well, that's not what my Bible says. In James it tells us to rejoice when we encounter trials of many kinds, because those trials develop perseverance. And in Peter it says, don't be surprised when you endure difficulties. Now, if that says that we shouldn't be surprised, then obviously it's a normal part of a Christian experience. If you're experiencing trials, don't let the devil tell you that it's your fault, that you're somehow done something wrong. Of course, when things go wrong, we do examine ourselves and ask, is there some sin in me that needs dealing with? But if you don't see anything obvious, don't go beating yourself up. Difficulties are a natural part of this life, but God is with us and He works through each of those difficulties to make us stronger. So today I want to be really real with you. I want to share how awesome our God is and how greatly He is to be praised. But I also want to share with you some of the difficulties I've gone through, because too often I think in the Christian church we spend a lot of time talking about how great it is to be a Christian, and it is great to be a Christian, and how great our God is, but we gloss over the fact that we also go through difficulties. We also go through times when we cry out, why God, why is this happening? What on earth are you doing? And that's okay. Right, now as Cindy says, I'm from New Zealand and I have 5 children and we homeschool. I want to give you just a little bit of background and then launch into some of our story. I gave my heart to the Lord when I was 14 years old at a Christian youth rally. When I was 16, I met my future husband, and within a few weeks both of us knew that we were the people that God had for each other. We got married on my 19th birthday, Rob was 20, and a couple of years later we had our first child. During the first 5 years of our marriage, we did what I guess most young married people do. We went about our business. We both worked until the first child was born, then I left work to be a full-time mum. We bought a house when we got married. We made friends. We went to church. We just got on with the daily ins and outs of life. The thing was that by the end of 5 years, we were in a huge financial mess. Some of it was through our own bad decisions, and some of it was just life happening. Times when Rob had been out of work and we'd perhaps used a credit card to make ends meet. All in all, we ended up with more debt than we could handle, and we were falling further and further behind in the payments. Also, our house value had dropped. We'd paid $102,000 for it 5 years earlier. We owed $85,000 in mortgages, but the value of the house was now only $70,000. We couldn't even sell it to pay it off if we wanted to. Through that stress of being financially in the hole and everything else that happened, everything came to our head and our marriage nearly failed. But God was gracious, and He took us through that crisis and restored our marriage. We renewed our commitment to each other and to Him. And after we did that, we realised that by just living in the rat race that we were in our early marriage, that God had no longer been completely in control of our lives. When we were young, as teenagers, we'd been really on fire for the Lord. God and everything He was doing was just so important to us. And while we still loved the Lord, we still went to church, somehow that first love for God had just fizzled a bit, and God had no longer been in first place in our lives. And now we wanted that to change. We cried out, God, we want to serve You. We want our life to have some meaning. We feel like we're just going around in a circle, getting nowhere. If we died tomorrow, it feels as if our life would have counted for nothing. Lord, we want to do something for You. Some great thing. What is it, Lord? What do You want us to do for You? If You want us to shine right here where we are, then if You want us to live this way, help us to shine right here where we are. But if this is not what You have planned for us, then please, Lord, show us what You want us to do. As we prayed like this for several weeks, we felt that God gave us a picture of one day doing 3 things. Firstly, to live somewhere quite remote. Secondly, to be fairly self-sufficient. And thirdly, to minister to people He would bring across our paths. Well, that sounded great, but it sounded like a retirement dream. I mean, here we were, we couldn't even sell the house and pay it off. How could we possibly buy land or go and move somewhere remote? So we prayed more, Lord, show us what to do now. And God said, I want you to get out of debt. Well, that made sense. So I grabbed pen and paper and worked it all out and said, well, Lord, if You could just help us meet our minimum payments on everything, which we weren't doing at that point, we were just falling further and further behind, then we could pay off all our smaller debts in 5 years, the credit cards, the HPs, that kind of thing, and then we can really hammer those mortgages. But the Lord said, no, I want you debt-free in 2 years. Wow, how are we going to do that? Then we figured, well, if God is for us, we can do anything, right? Rob said he'd get a 3rd job. I figured I could try and make some money too. But the more we prayed about it, the more we felt the Lord say, no, Rob is to leave work. What? Rob leave work? We've got 2 children, 2 mortgages, we're behind in everything, and Rob's to leave his job? Wow, that just didn't make any sense. But the more we prayed about it for several months, the Lord kept confirming it as His will. He was so patient with us. He kept showing us over and over again that this was really what He wanted us to do. And He kept saying, trust Me, I will provide. Trust Me. About this time, I was offered a full-time job with a company I was doing some part-time bookkeeping for, and that job would have paid about $60,000 a year. Ordinarily, we believed it was best for Mum to be home with the children and Dad to be the income earner, but we figured that maybe, just maybe, for a short time we could do it this way so that we could get out of this hole. I asked the Lord, please have this job confirmed to me in writing before Rob hands his notice in. It had just been offered verbally. And God gave us a verse in Scripture, Psalm 119, and it said, My word is a lamp unto your feet and a light unto your path. And as I read that, I just pictured in my mind a person walking through a forest carrying an old-fashioned lamp. And that lantern would light a circle of light around them and around their feet. And as they moved forward, the circle of light would move forward, but they couldn't focus it ahead of them like you could with a torch. It only moved forward as they did. And as I pictured that, I knew the Lord was saying that He'd shown us the next step and that we needed to take it, and that when we'd taken it, then the step after that would be lit up for us. We prayed one more time, Lord, is this really what You want? Do You really want Rob to hand in his notice and leave work? The scripture we had that day was in Matthew, and it said, O ye of little faith, why do you still doubt Me? Ooh, that was painful. So it was time to put our money where our mouth was and get on with it. Rob handed in his notice, his company replaced him, and the following week, the company that had offered me a position went bankrupt and completely disappeared. So very quickly we got to a point where we had no income, no job, huge debt, and we had no idea what was coming next. All we could do was cling to what God had told us. Trust Me, I will provide. Within a very short time, we had only $35 left in our bank account. It was a Friday, and I worked out that by Monday we needed $600 to pay the overdue mortgage bill, to pay the overdue power bill so they wouldn't cut it off, and to buy some food. And I turned to God and I said, Lord, You said You would provide. Now what? And God said, I want you to give away your $35. Well, this was a whole new territory for us. We'd never heard of living by faith. I'd never read the stories of George Mueller or any of those other famous Christians. And I thought, am I hearing this right? And I asked my husband, and we discussed it, and he said, well, what have we got to lose? So that day I wrote out cheques to 2 charities I just happened to have literature for on my desk, and we mailed them on Saturday. We told no one of our position either, because God had said early on that our finances were to be between us and Him alone, and that when He provided, it would be for His glory. So all weekend I'm praying, oh God, show us we're not crazy. Lord, please provide. Show us we haven't lost our minds. We went to church on Sunday, and in the car we found enough loose change that we could scrape together to buy a loaf of bread. So after church we went to the supermarket. As we came out the supermarket, the lady from our church who was the treasurer was coming in, and she said, oh, I'm glad I bumped into you. As I was totalling up the offering today, there was this envelope in the offering bag, and it had written on the front, please give this to Rob and Cindy Hancox. And you left before I could catch you. So here it is. And she handed us an envelope. We walked out of the supermarket with shaking hands. I opened the envelope, and in it was $600 in cash. Praise the Lord! Hallelujah! God had provided. We went home with much excitement. And God continued to provide in very interesting ways. Meanwhile, we were praying, Lord, what is the next step? Rob's left work, but now we feel like we're sitting here in limbo. We can't just sit here forever. Thank you for providing, but what do we do now? Rob had spent some time going to town and reading job advertisements, seeing what, if anything, would strike him, but nothing kind of leapt out. One day, I was sitting at home while Rob went to town to run some errands and to check out the notice boards for any jobs and things. As I was praying, I was saying, Lord, what do we do now? And God said, I've given you a vision, move towards it. And I was thinking about this. He gave us a vision to live remote, be self-sufficient, minister to people. Move towards it. How do we do that? As I'm thinking this, I was flicking through a local newspaper that came out each week for free. And suddenly an advertisement jumped out the back and hit me between the eyeballs, as these things sometimes do. The advertisement said, have you ever considered training in dairy farming or agriculture? And suddenly I thought, that's it. I was raised on a farm. I've been around animals my whole life. But if we're going to be self-sufficient, Rob, who's a city boy and hardly knows the front end of a cow from the back end, is going to need to learn something. That's it. He needs some training. When Rob got home, I told him what I'd been praying and what I felt the Lord had shown me, and he confirmed it, saying that when he'd gone and looked at the job boards, the only jobs that struck him or stuck in his mind were farming jobs, and he'd never considered farming before. He'd been a printer and a commercial artist all of his life, so far. So he rang up about this dairy farming course and was told that it was TOPS funded. Now, TOPS is a New Zealand organisation called Training Opportunities. They provide funding for reskilling or upskilling the long-term unemployed. Because it was TOPS funded, you had to have been unemployed for 26 weeks in order to be eligible to go on the course. When Rob explained he'd only been unemployed for 2 weeks, they said, well, there's no way you can do this. But he wasn't deterred. He went to see the employment services the next day, and they said, well, they were very sympathetic, and they said that maybe his low high school qualifications would make him eligible for the course, but it wasn't up to them. We needed to go and see TOPS themselves. So off we went to visit Training Opportunities. We explained our situation and that we wanted to go on the course. But the lady that was listening to us, she said, nope, absolutely not, no way, you must be 26 weeks unemployed. And she spun on her heel and walked away from us. My heart just fell. It lurched in my chest and I felt, oh God, I was so sure this was the right thing. And suddenly that lady spun around on her heel, held up one finger and said, unless. I thought, here goes. Unless you've got some sort of major disability, a broken back, you're missing an arm, missing a leg, you're deaf, you're blind, any of those kinds of things. Rob and I looked at each other and we said, coincidentally, well, we don't believe in coincidences, I call them God instances, but anyway, coincidentally, the previous week we had taken Rob to the audiology department of the local hospital to be tested for a hearing aid. The tests had showed that he was profoundly deaf in one ear. I said to the lady, will that do? She said, that will do, go and see Workbridge. So we went off to visit yet another government department we'd never heard before, and they wrote out an exemption, and the following day Rob was on the dairy farming course. Along with the dairy farming course came a small student allowance, which helped us to meet our minimum daily requirements, although it came nowhere close to providing all of our needs. One week, we had no money yet again, and none coming in for a while, and I just desperately needed a few dollars for some milk and some bread. And so I went back to the Lord and said, Lord, I need some money. Will you provide? Not long after that I went out to the letterbox to check the mail, and lo and behold, a $10 note came blowing up the footpath literally to my feet. I looked around, there was no one who could have dropped it, and so I picked it up and thanked God for his provision once again. Not long after this, I'd felt the Lord saying that one day he was going to ask us to move somewhere, and that we wouldn't be able to take many of our possessions with us, and that we should be ready just to let them go. I had a bit of a clean out, sold a few things, gave away a few things. Looking back, I can see this was actually God preparing my heart not to be so attached to things, to possessions, but to be ready just to go where he wants us to go, and to be willing to leave things behind. We rented out our house and got a house that was provided by a veterinary service where we manned telephones after hours during the weekends during public holidays, and they provided the house as part of the deal. So while we didn't get enough in rent to cover the mortgage on the house, at least that kind of relieved the pressure a little bit while Rob was on the course. As the course was coming to an end, it was time to search for a farming position for when the end of the course came, and we looked for work all over the North Island of New Zealand. New Zealand is divided into two main islands, the North Island and the South Island, and we'd lived all our lives in the upper part of the North Island around the Auckland area. Neither of us had ever been to the South Island, and by this time I was pregnant with our third child, and all of my family was in Auckland, and there was no way I wanted to move too far away when a baby was due. So we looked for work all over the North Island, and we just kept missing out. Finally, one day I got a phone call from one boss to say that it had come down to a decision between us and one other couple, and in the end he couldn't make up his mind, so he tossed a coin, and he was very sorry, but we'd missed out. As I hung up from that phone call, I looked up at the calendar that was next to the phone. It was from a local Christian radio station, and I noticed that the end of the month had come and it was time to tear off another page. As I ripped off the page and looked at the photo on the new page, I saw a beautiful picture of a kiwi fruit orchard in Golden Bay in the top of the South Island. And I thought, maybe we should think about work in the South Island. And I remembered that when we'd applied or looked at the advertisement for this last job that we'd just been turned down from, there'd also been one that had caught our eye that was in the South Island. It was a position that had sounded perfect except for its location. I went and dug out the ad, rang up the people that were advertising and asked, "Have you found a worker yet?" They told me they were just coming to a final decision between 3 different people, and I thanked them for their time anyway. But the sharemilker's wife said, "Just tell me about your husband." So I told her about Rob, and she said, "Well, he sounds really good. Can you send us a CV?" I said, "Sure." So I mailed off the CV, and when Rob came home, I told him we'd just applied for a job in the South Island. He got really excited, and in the end we found a friend with a fax machine so we could send the CV through even quicker. Oh, a CV is a curriculum vitae or a resume. It's just a word we use here in New Zealand. Anyway, to cut a long story short, we began to get really excited about this possible job. But the thing was, all the other potential employees were travelling to Culverden in the South Island, tiny little dot just above Christchurch, for job interviews, and there was no way we could afford for Rob to travel down there. We prayed and prayed, God, make some way for us to go, because going for an actual face-to-face interview is distinctly an advantage when applying for this kind of job. But God kept saying, "No, you're not to go. I've got it under control." And he did. To cut a long story short, for one reason or another, all the other potential employees were eliminated and we were given the position. So we had 1 month to move to the South Island. We couldn't afford to take any of our furniture with us because the cost of shipping it was too high. We had to sell everything that we owned, and we did. We held garage sales, we gave things away, we sold stuff through the paper. Every cent that came in we used to pay bills. So in the end we had nothing left even when we got there. We even sold our car. You see, we had a little car that we had brought with a loan, because back in the days when we were running things our way, our car had come to the end of its life, and when we needed a new one, we did what a lot of people do, we got out a loan on it. But now we were committed to getting out of debt, and I'd been thinking, well, the car is depreciated. It probably wouldn't sell for even enough to pay it off. But what if that's what God wants us to do? And a growing feeling came that we should try and sell the car and pay it off. So in the end I advertised it for just enough to pay it off, which was probably a little more than it was really worth, and it sold straight away. Yahoo! One less debt of about $5,000, but no car, and in 1 week's time we're due to leave for the South Island by car. Well, there wasn't much we could do about it, so we just gave it to God and said, "Well, Lord, we've done our part in trying to get out of debt. Would you please provide?" Rob's grandmother asked him to come and visit her about then. She'd heard that we were thinking of moving to the South Island. She was a dear old saint and a real prayer, a real backbone of the family in terms of prayer support. and she told Rob that she wanted to give us a small amount of money to use for whatever we thought was the most urgent need, and she gave us $1,000, which was just so sweet of her. Anyway, a few days later, it was our last weekend in Auckland, and our church was having a shared lunch after church to farewell us. Rob arranged to borrow his mother's car so that we could get to church that day, and as I was getting the young children ready for church in the morning, Rob went off up to the local town centre to have a look at a car fair that was being held there. He came whizzing back at 9:20 and said, "I've seen a car, I think we should look at it," and the guy said he'd hold it till 9:30 for you to have a look at. So we all jumped in the car and we went screaming back up to the town centre. There was no parking available. In the end, Rob just pulled to the side of the main entrance, and we literally jumped down a wall into the area where the car fair was being held, landing right beside this prospective car, just as another potential buyer was about to climb into the front seat. But the owner looked up, saw Rob, and said, "Oh, he's just in time. I said he had first option." So Rob shows me the car, and I said, "We've got no time. We're supposed to be at church. There's no time to take it for a test drive. Have you driven it?" And he said, "Yes," very quickly. And I said, "Well, is it okay?" He says, "I think so." I said, "Does everything work?" "I think so," he says. So I look at the price. It's $1,495. And I know, as far as I know, we've only got about 1,000. So I said to the owner, "Will you take offers?" And he says, "Well, try me." So I said, $1,000. And he said, "Nope, absolutely not. No way. It's worth more than that." So I stood there praying, "Lord, we had a garage sale yesterday, and I haven't even added up the change from it yet. I don't know how much it is, but it's not much. How much can I offer, Lord? I need your help." So praying, I turned to him and said, 1,250. And his mouth in front of me, it formed the word no. I could see it coming, and suddenly he's nodding his head and saying, "Oh, okay." Turned out his wife was standing behind me where I couldn't see her, and it had really been her car, and she was giving us the nod and just nodding her head. So he agreed. It also turned out that this dear lady had been brought up in Culverden, in that tiny spot we were about to move to. She'd had a pet calf when she was a child that she fed by hand, and she'd named the calf Betty Bucket. So when she had this little white car that we were now buying, she'd named that Betty Bucket. It was really quite funny. Anyway, we arranged that we would go ahead to church and that they would come by after church and drop off the car, and we would give them the money. They actually lived several hours south of Auckland, but they'd travelled all the way up that day specially to sell the car, and they were going to go and visit some friends that morning. After church, we got the $1,000 out the bank that Rob's grandmother had given us, and we went home to count the change from the garage sale. When we added it all up, we had enough to buy the car to the cent. Looked like Betty Bucket was headed back for Christchurch. Back to Culverden, rather. In the second Oops Bible study, Cindy asked the question, "Are you where you want to be, where you expected to be?" She was talking about our spiritual life with God, but it got me thinking about expectations. You see, when we left for the South Island, I had a lot of dreams and a lot of expectations. And I really want to share some of those with you today, so you can see where my heart was at as we left. Because as I thought about this the other day, I suddenly realised a lot of things about myself I hadn't realised before. As we set off on our voyage for the South Island, and on this whole adventure, we were really clinging to the verse in Proverbs 3, verse 5 and 6 that says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all of your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths." God was really leading us, and we knew that, and so we were full of expectation that God was going to do awesome things. And he was, but they didn't always turn out just quite like we expected. It was really clear in our minds that we were to do those 3 things one day, that we were going to live somewhere remote, be self-sufficient, minister to people that he would bring across our paths. In our enthusiasm, however, we added a lot to those 3 basic things. Those were the 3 things God told us, but we had lots of fun imagining just how that might work, what kind of place we were going to live, exactly what we were going to do there, and how it was all going to come together. I also had this expectation that things were somehow going to be really perfect. What I didn't realise at the time was that our greatest testimony and some of our greatest ministry opportunities comes from our hard times, our valleys. And if you think about mountains and valleys in the natural, have you ever noticed that valleys are often pretty wide? It takes a long time to cross them. Those mountain peaks, well, they tend to be more sharp and narrow. The view from the top is awesome and it's worth the climb, but it's not very long before you're headed back down the other side to the next valley or perhaps plateau. And it's like that in the spiritual as well. Sometimes it can seem a long time to walk through the valleys, and those mountains are really awesome. Those high points, those great things that happen, they're what give us a boost of enthusiasm. They're what keep us hoping and help us to get through the hard times. But we do tend to spend, quite often, a lot more time in the valleys than we spend on the actual mountain peaks. which again is why I want to be really honest with you today. I also had tucked away in my heart the dream that I would one day homeschool my children. As we left, our oldest was only about 3, and the next one was 2, and I was pregnant with our third. When the oldest had been 8 months old, I'd heard Dr. James Dobson on the radio one day doing an interview about homeschooling. At that point, I had never heard of homeschooling. I knew no one who did it, nor even if it was legal in New Zealand, but the thought struck to me, that is what I'm going to do. So tucked away in my heart was the expectation that we would one day homeschool. I also thought I was going to be the perfect mum, and I was going to have perfect kids. They were going to be so sweet and so obedient and so lovely. I was going to keep a perfect house. It was going to be clean all the time. And we were going to grow most of our own food, and I was going to cook it all. And, of course, I would sew all of our own clothes. Now, never mind that up to this point, from the day we'd married, I'd struggled with keeping the house. I had no idea really how to do it. But that didn't matter. We were setting off on this great adventure. God was leading us. God was in control. Everything was just going to be perfect now, right? I really had no idea. Anyway, as we arrived in the South Island, all that we owned was our little car, a trailer that we'd brought and piled all of our basic possessions on. We had some bedding and some pots and pans and a box of toys for the kids. We had a cat sitting in a box behind one of the seats, 2 kids in the back seat, me and Rob in the front. As we were driving south, the rear vision mirror was useless because Rob couldn't see through the back window. The trailer was kind of piled as high as we could make it, and the side mirror kept flopping uselessly against the car. Rob got really frustrated with that at first until he felt the Lord say to his heart, "Don't worry about it. There's no looking back. All you need to do is look forward." When we arrived in the South Island, we had only these things that were with us. We had no money because we'd spent everything that we got from the garage sales paying bills. We were going to a house that we had never seen. The sharemilkers had been very kind. They'd sent us a photo of our new home. It showed a lovely row of trees, and there was an arrow pointing behind the trees saying, "The house is behind here." When we arrived, the sharemilkers lent us a little bit of furniture, some beds for the kids, and the house already had a fridge and a basic little table and chairs and a ratty old couch in it, so we had enough to just kind of get started until we could earn some money and buy some more things. The house also was gorgeous. When we arrived, and it was dark, and I went inside first while Rob unloaded the trailer, and I just took one look and thought, my goodness, this is just what I've always dreamed of. It was a huge old villa, 12-foot high ceilings, a great long hall down the middle, huge bedrooms, beautiful carved woodwork around the fireplaces, some built-in furniture, a veranda right around the outside. It was just gorgeous. It was my heart's desire. God had given us my heart's desire. But I found out pretty quick that that particular desire just wasn't so practical. Within a few weeks it was snowing. The temperature dropped to -10 degrees, that's Celsius, and stayed there for about 3 weeks. The power was out for long periods, and we just couldn't heat the house except for the tiny little dining room that had a log burner in it. So we had to shove the ratty old couch, the table and chairs, and all of us and the worker that lived in the house with us into the dining room to try and stay warm. Ben was due to be born in the midst of this, but fortunately he sensibly waited an extra 3 weeks until the roads were clear and I could get to the hospital, and the power was back on before he was actually born. Our expectation was that we would stay in this place at this job for at least a year. After all, this was our first dairy farming position, and Rob needed to get experience and a good reference. But within a couple of months of our being there, we felt the Lord nudging us and saying, "No, you're not staying here. I used this to get you to the South Island, but in fact, you're going to move on." Now, we really resisted that because it just didn't seem like the right thing to do, but God kept telling us. In the end, a circumstance occurred that made it necessary for us to move. There was an employee who was moved into the house with us. We didn't have any choice in the matter, and he started physically abusing our young children, who were too young to really tell what was going on. He'd hit them and kicked them when we weren't looking, and when we realised what was happening and went to the bosses, they refused to do anything about it, so we immediately resigned and moved to a new position. The Bible says in Isaiah 55:8-9, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." You see, we had expectations of how God was going to do things on this adventure, this journey to being out of debt and living in this remote place. But God didn't always do them the way that we thought he should. Sometimes things were a lot harder than we might have hoped or expected, and sometimes things just didn't go quite how we'd planned. We moved to another little town where we had another dairy farming job. It turned out not to be a great situation either. The bosses there had quite a reputation for being rather unpleasant people, and in the end Rob couldn't stand it for more than a couple of months. But God provided another home for us in that same town, and from there he began to really use us. You see, over the next 10 years we would have moved house about 23 times. That was not our plan. We would never have wanted to move house that often, but it was God's plan. Everywhere that he took us, he had a place for us, and he had something he wanted us to do. Sometimes it was lessons for us to learn, and sometimes it was opportunities to help and serve other people, and often it was both. At the time we thought it was just all part of the plan. We were going to get out of debt, and then God was going to somehow provide us with this property where we were going to live this perfect life and minister to people. But that wasn't quite how it worked out. Everywhere we went, God had lessons and people that he wanted us to help. But as soon as we'd finished helping them, he'd move us on to the next place. While we were in that second town, we'd been in the South Island about 6 months, we began to feel it was right to put our house in Auckland on the market. We'd rented it out, remember, when we left. It was time to put it on the market and try and pay it off. Now, property prices had come up just a little bit, but still nowhere near enough to even pay the mortgage off, and we so did not want to sell our house and still be paying a mortgage on it for a house we didn't even own. So I said, "Oh Lord, please, would you just make it pay itself off? Please, Lord." We put it on the market, we fixed our price at just enough to pay it off. The agents kept coming back to us with offers, but nearly all of them were rent-to-buy type situations. It really didn't work out very well for us in the long run, so I kept turning them down. It seemed to go on interminably. The agents kept pressuring us to accept these offers that really weren't enough to pay it off, and I kept saying no. But God gave us a scripture that we just clung to. It said, "Commit your way to the Lord, trust in him, and he will do this. Be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him." That's from Psalm 37. So we just waited, and at the end of what actually turned out to only be 1 month, but seemed like an interminably long time, our house did sell. It sold for just enough to pay off the mortgages and to pay the agent's fees and the legal part. But we still owed rates on the house, and I was a little disappointed because I thought, well, Lord, I really wanted to pay off everything to do with the house. But when all the paperwork came through, I discovered that there was a mortgage repayment insurance document. We'd taken out this insurance against the repayment of our mortgage in the event of either of us dying when we first bought the house, and we'd paid for it in a lump sum, and I'd forgotten all about it. Because we'd sold the house and were paying off the mortgage early, there was a rebate, and when the money came through, it was enough to cover those outstanding rates, which is what our council tax on land is called here, rates. And we walked away in the end from the house with $1.32. We didn't own anything. We didn't have any of the money we'd invested in our deposit or decorating the house, but we didn't owe anything on it either. God was good. Jim Elliot was a famous missionary to the Orcas, and he was killed in the line of duty, but he's famous for having said, "He is no fool who gives up what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose." God had asked us to give up our home, our possessions, our right to live in Auckland and be near our family and friends. And we had given all those things up, but we ultimately couldn't have kept them anyway. And in return, we have had back the amazing experience of living in some of the most beautiful and remote parts of New Zealand. We've seen miracle after miracle happen right before our eyes, and we've had the sweet knowledge that God loves us and is in control of every aspect of our lives. Along the way, God has miraculously provided our needs. For example, when we lived in Murchison, I became pregnant with our 4th child, Sarah. We still had the little white Chevette Betty bucket that we'd got just before we left Auckland, but it was rapidly becoming too small for us. In fact, already, because we lived so far from a major town, if I wanted to go grocery shopping, by the time I put the kids in the car, I needed to take the trailer on the back just to fit the groceries in. And now that we had a 4th child on the way, we obviously were going to need a van, but we had no money with which to buy one, so we took it to the Lord in prayer. And not long after that, we were given a 9-seater luxury van. In one place we lived, we had a lot of meat because we were living on a farm, and so there was a lot of meat available from the farm animals, and I was just longing for some fish. I would have loved to have some fish to eat, but again, we couldn't afford to buy such a luxury. One day I was hanging out the washing and talking to the Lord. I find the washing line's a great place to talk to God. And I said, "Oh Lord, I just love some fish." Not long after that, the phone rang, and when I answered it, a friend from up the road said, "Would you like some salmon? We've got some salmon in the freezer, and it's more than we can use. Can I drop some off to you?" I said, "Well, sure." Well, the next thing, she dropped off a huge trash bag full of whole salmon. God likes to provide abundantly, even more than we might ask. Our God is an awesome God. Remember I told you that he'd said he wanted us out of debt in 2 years. Well, 2 years, almost to the day from the time he said that, we paid off our last debt. I couldn't even now recall exactly how that happened. I mean, obviously we'd sold the house and we'd sold the car, but there were other debts besides, and yet the Lord had provided little by little amounts of money, and we had just used those to pay off those debts. And suddenly they were all gone. We didn't own anything, but we didn't owe anything either, and that was a really neat feeling. The thing was, though, we had expected that as soon as we were out of debt, God would show us and provide for us this property where we were going to live and where we were going to minister to people. So we kept expecting that to happen. And every time we saw a place that seemed like it would be just perfect, we'd wait expectantly for God to move, and yet he never opened the door. In the meantime, we'd endured quite a few ups and downs. We'd had all the positive experiences of God's provision, but we'd been through some hard things too. We'd endured accidents and health problems. We'd been abused and misunderstood, especially by family who had no idea what we were doing and thought we were completely mad. The hardest thing, though, I think, was waiting. All the other trials, they're okay. You know God's in control and you just kind of bear up with it and you continue to trust in the Lord. But I still find waiting a really hard thing. So often we'd be finished in one place doing what God had for us, and he would have told us that we were going to move on, and yet we wouldn't know where to just yet. And we'd be once again waiting for God to show us and to open the way. And I still find that sense of being in limbo very frustrating, even though we've done it a lot of times. A few years after we'd been in the South Island and we'd moved around quite a bit, we were once again seeking God as to what we were to do. Lord, we just had it so on our heart to be settled somewhere long term, and we just really wanted him to show us where and how. At this point we were thinking about the fact that the picture that God had used on that calendar back in Auckland to get us to the South Island had been of a place in Golden Bay, and every physical move we'd made since then had seemed to move us slowly, geographically, closer and closer to Golden Bay. So we began to wonder, Lord, is that it? Is that where we're going to end up, in Golden Bay? So one day we packed up our kids and our picnic lunch, and we decided to go for a drive into Golden Bay because we had never been there. It's quite an isolated spot. And we prayed, Lord, please show us as we're there if this is where we're going to end up, if this is the place you have for us. So we drove over this big hill into Golden Bay, and we went for a picnic at a famous springs, and we had a really good day. But both of us felt that the answer was no. Golden Bay was not our ultimate destination. While we were there, we picked up a local magazine that was really only a few photocopied pieces of paper stuck together, so we could have a look and see what rental prices were like in Golden Bay, just in case. As we were driving home, Rob was driving and I was reading through this little newspaper, and I saw an ad that really struck me. I laughed and I read it again, and I thought, no, that's ridiculous, we can't do that. But Rob had seen my interest, so he asked me what it was all about, and I said, oh, it's just silly, never mind. And he said, no, read it. Well, this ad was for a caretaker. Someone was advertising wanting a caretaker for a 2,000-acre property in the Marlborough Sounds. The catch was that there's no roads out there, that access is by boat only. Pig hunting might be involved, and there was no actual pay with this position. It was basically a free house in return for caretaking. But on the one hand, it sounded so perfect. This was the kind of place we dreamed of living. We loved being near the water. We wanted to be remote and self-sufficient, and you'd certainly have to be that out there. But really, no roads? That might be taking it just a bit too far. But anyway, we thought about it some and decided to contact the advertiser. It turned out to be a widow whose husband had died and who wanted someone to take care of the property. We got talking to her and it just sounded so perfect, but she'd already given the position to another couple who'd applied earlier from an earlier newspaper advertisement, and she hadn't thought she'd get any more replies. However, she asked us to keep in touch, which we did. Now, it was really amazing. We began to get really excited about this property. Everywhere we turned, God seemed to confirm to us that this particular spot was where we were going to be. And so we decided that that just was so right, and we decided to cling to it. Well, God gave it to us to cling to. We thought, okay, the caretaker she's got isn't going to work out, he's going to move on, and we're going to have that place. Now, it turned out he really wasn't the greatest caretaker. In fact, he was downright hopeless. And my darling husband, who's a very practical person, would just get so frustrated whenever we'd hear from the owner that this guy was just not doing what he was meant to be doing. And Rob would think, but I could have done that, I would have done that. It just wasn't fair. But we had to be patient. God opened amazing opportunities. We actually met the lady one day on a boat ride to somewhere else. I called her up one day and it happened to be her birthday. We just struck this real rapport and we just knew it was right. Meanwhile, time went by. We moved house a few more times, changed job a few more times. 2 years went by and we were still waiting to go to this place that God had shown us. We were faced with yet another change of job and yet another move, and I was just praying, oh God, this time, open this door. Please, Lord, let us go to this place that we've waited for so long. And it looked like it was going to happen. The caretaker was making noises about moving, but then he didn't. And the lady was just too nice to ask him to leave. Once again, we weren't going to be going there. And I was getting so frustrated and so tired of waiting. I got to the point where I couldn't take it anymore. Cindy read a verse from the Bible the other day that said, hope deferred makes the heart sick. And that's what it felt like. We'd waited for so long, we'd so wanted this thing, and our lives were just seemed to be just in limbo, waiting for it to happen, and yet all these other things we were having to deal with, changes of house and changes of job, and this hope has still not been realised, and my heart felt sick. So I said, Lord, I can't wait for this anymore. I can't just hang on to this anymore. It's driving me nuts. Lord, I give this whole idea back to you. If this is of you, then make it happen in your time. But in the meantime, I'm just giving it back to you, because I can't go on like this. So I gave it up to God. The problem was, I didn't just give it up to God. I actually got to the point where I talked myself out of even wanting the whole idea anymore. I could think of all the reasons why it would be a silly idea, why it would be hard to live in that place, why it wasn't such a good plan in the first place. And that's when I began to suffer from depression. This was the first time that I'd ever suffered from depression, and I had no idea what it was for a long time. I thought I was losing my mind. I had just turned 30. We had 5 children under 8 years of age. I was rather hormonal because my fertility was just coming back. My youngest was 14 months old, and I'm not fertile when I'm breastfeeding for up to 14 months. So my hormones were kind of raging all over the place. I was also very frustrated. My oldest was still not reading. He was 8, and I come from a long line of public school teachers. My mother, it seemed, was always ringing me up and saying, "Isn't that child reading yet? If they're not reading by the time they're 6, they'll never catch up. You've ruined them for life," and things like that, which I just found really hard to take. I wasn't coping very well with all the children. At least I didn't feel I was. The house was always a wreck, and I felt like a total failure. I was getting very emotional. I couldn't seem to control my emotions. One day it all came to a head and I got angry. The children were just playing around. It was time for me to prepare supper, and you know what young kids can be like just before supper time. They kind of get a bit scratchy. Well, they were mucking around and they were being noisy and they were fighting a bit, and suddenly I just couldn't take it. Something in me just snapped and I just got so angry, and so I yelled at them all. I told them to go to their rooms and to get out of my sight and stay there because I couldn't deal with them. Meanwhile, I was trying to cut up the meatloaf, slice it into nice slices, but instead of moving the knife nicely through the meatloaf, I was slashing it with violent downward chopping movements with the knife. I was so angry, and I was taking it out on this meatloaf. My husband came out of the bathroom when he heard me yelling at the kids, and he patiently tried to calm me down. He rubbed my back and tried to soothe me. He said, "It's okay, honey, it'll be okay." Well, I slammed that knife down on the bench. I turned around, I grabbed him by the front of his shirt. Now remember, I'm a really calm person. I have a long, slow fuse. I never just lose it. But this day I was so wild. I turned around, I grabbed him by the front of the shirt. He's 6'4" and a really big guy. And I shook him, and I said, "I don't want to calm down. I want to smash something." I was so angry. Well, I left my husband to finish preparing dinner, and I went to my bedroom and I sat on the bed and tried to calm down, and all I could think in this dazed sort of way is, I'm so angry. But why am I so angry? I had no idea. I just couldn't figure it out. I went to the doctor and told him I thought there must be something wrong with me and I was losing my mind. He examined me, he asked me a bunch of questions, and basically in the end said that I was just a normal stressed mum with young kids and that I should go out with my husband more often. Well, that was a nice thought, but it wasn't actually physically possible. We had no one around us that could help look after the kids and no money, and besides which I was way past at that point just simple lifestyle changes to relieve the stress. As a Christian, I'd never consider suicide an option, and my conviction about that hadn't changed, but I did get to the point where I could understand why other people would decide to end it all, why they would feel that life would be better if they just didn't have to struggle anymore, if they could just give up. I never realised until much later how easy it is for even a convicted Christian to get from thinking that way to actually becoming suicidal. Shortly after this, we moved house yet again, and then we went to visit some friends. This weekend was the closest I'd had to a holiday in years. I didn't have to take bedding, I didn't have to take food, just a change of clothes for each of us, put the kids in the car and go. And we went to stay the weekend with these dear friends. They have 8 children and 50 acres of land, and we've been friends for a long time, since the beginning of our homeschool journey. So all the kids and my husband were all happily occupied, and I got 2 days to do what I so needed to do, to sit and talk with a trusted friend and just pour out my heart. Her older daughters did most of the cooking. I didn't really have to do anything except make sure my baby was okay and just talk. And as I shared everything I was thinking and feeling, and the one thing that had really scared me was the fact that I felt like I didn't love my children anymore. Yes, I was still their mum. Yes, I still cared for them, but I just felt so frustrated by them all the time that I felt as if they could all just disappear and it wouldn't bother me at all, and that had really frightened me. And as I described this to my friend and all the other things I've been feeling and how my emotions were all over the place, she said to me, you know, that's just how I felt. A while before this, when she'd had her 8th child, she had suffered from placenta previa and she had hemorrhaged and nearly died. And then, to top it all off, her baby, who was born prematurely, required huge amounts of physical therapy, about 4 hours every day, and it was painful therapy that made him scream. She had to do this with him every day while still trying to recover from her own caesarean and all the other problems, and homeschool her other 7 children. Needless to say, she'd gotten a bit stressed and then finally depressed, so she was able to recognise how I was feeling and what was happening with me. I went back from that weekend feeling like, it's okay, I'm not crazy. There's a name to what's wrong with me. Woohoo! There's a name. It's really something wrong. And knowing that, I felt like if there's something wrong, I can get better. I can figure this out and I can get over it. So I went home and I started to pray, Lord, why am I depressed? Because if I'm depressed, there must be a reason. And if there's a reason, if I can just figure it out, maybe I can get over it. So as I prayed, I felt God answer me, you've lost your sense of vision. And I realised that he was right. And letting go of this dream of this place we believed we were meant to be, I'd also let go of all my sense of purpose for everything we were doing in the South Island, all the struggles that we had had for several years at that point, all the hard times we'd gone through. I'd let go of any sense that we were doing this for a reason, that God had a plan and a purpose. And in losing that sense of vision and that sense of trust, it all seemed so hopeless and so hard, and that is what had led to my depression. So I said, okay, God, what do I do? And he said, ask me to renew your sense of vision. So I did. I simply prayed, God, please give me back my sense of vision. And over the next few weeks, he did that. He restored my hope. He restored the dream that I'd given up on. And he restored my sense of purpose. And he helped me get to know myself better. I learnt a lot of things about myself. I learnt that I can't cram as much into every day as I used to be able to do, that I can't cope with a whole bunch of things at once, and that that's okay, that I need to be gentle and take it easy on myself, that I can't get away with the lack of sleep that I used to be able to cope with without having to catch it up somewhere along the line. Now, shortly after God renewed this sense of vision, suddenly the whole Marlborough Sounds thing seemed to suddenly be happening. And we actually moved out into the Marlborough Sounds, first of all, not to the ultimate property we wanted to be on, but to another property, which turned out to be a really good introduction to life in the Sounds. And it was so cool living out there, self-sufficient because you basically had to grow your own food. There was no roads, only alternative power systems, and when we ended up on the property that God had promised to us, and we did within a few months, we actually installed our own power system. We had milking goats that we milked for milk. We caught fish. We had a net out every night. The mail came by a boat once a week, and we had the most glorious views. God provided our needs. It was the most tremendous place to live and to be. And we had lots of visitors too. People would come and see us often. One day in the first place that we were running low on firewood. There was actually hills all around us covered in pine trees that had been felled by the neighbour that owned the land around that particular place. But we couldn't get to any of this downed firewood because we had no vehicles, no roads, and no way of transporting it or getting up the hill to it. So we were saying, God, we really need some firewood. We needed the firewood to cook on our coal range, to heat our hot water, and to provide for our heating as well. Well, shortly after this, it turned out that the logging company that had felled all of this guy's trees had done it by helicopter, and they'd removed the trees they wanted, but he'd arranged for them to fell all the rest as well because he didn't want the pine trees. But now they had to come back because some of those pine trees had fallen over the water line, and the Department of Conservation weren't happy about that. So the helicopter was coming back to pick up the pine trees that had fallen over the water line, transport them further up the hill and dump them. Rob had a word with the pilot and asked if he would mind dropping 1 or 2 of those pine trees on our front lawn, and he said no problem, it's less fuel for us, no sweat. So that day we had firewood from heaven. We had 2 pine trees dropped by helicopter on our front lawn, and that provided our firewood needs for quite a while. Okay, so now we're living on the property that God had shown us 3 years earlier and had finally brought to pass, and we loved it. It was a great place to live, but it was very labour intensive, very time intensive way to live. Doing the washing was done with an old Ringer washing machine because of the type of power supply, and it would take me 3 hours a day just to do the laundry. I was grinding wheat and making bread by hand. Cooking on a coal range is pretty labour intensive too. You have to stand over it the whole time, feeding in the wood and making sure the temperature in the oven stays at just the right level. Now all these things were fine, but I was finding it pretty hard to live this kind of lifestyle, keep up with homeschooling the children as well, and not get totally exhausted. Also, it seemed to us that doors weren't opening that should have opened. Rob needed to get work. We were living for free in this house, but we still needed income for other things. And for 18 months now, we had had basically no income. So we were praying one day, Lord, why aren't you opening the doors? Why aren't things sort of coming together the way we imagined they would now we were here? This is actually really hard living like this. We love it, but it is really, really hard. Lord, we don't mind it being hard if it's your will for us, but please just confirm that we are doing the right thing, that we're not living this really physically hard lifestyle if it's for no purpose. If it's your will, that's fine. We're quite happy working really hard. But if it's not, then please show us. And it was like God had just waited for us to say that, to ask him. And as we did, he took us mentally back over I think it was 7 years at that point since we come to the South Island. He said, look at everywhere you've been. Look at everything that you have done. You've met families. You've been in the right place to help people. There was an old lady in a shop who was no longer able to cook her own meals, and we provided meals for. There was a new pastor in one area that needed help and support and encouragement, as well as physical help in getting his house sold and things to settle in. There was ministries that needed practical help. One place that had no one in 12 years to fix all their mechanical things, and Rob had done that. There was a sailor that would have been lost at sea if we hadn't intervened. Everywhere we had been, God had things for us to do, and everywhere we'd been, we'd lived in a degree of self-sufficiency. And it was like God said to us, you thought that those three things, living remote, being self-sufficient, ministering to people that I would bring across your path, you thought that was the ultimate goal, that you had to arrive at that place. But as I look back, I realised we'd been doing those things all along. For 7 years, we had been living in different remote parts of the South Island. We had been self-sufficient in many different ways in different places, and we had ministered to people God brought across our path all the way along. And God was saying, that wasn't the end goal, that was the mission statement, that was the journey that I was taking you on. So we said, well, what does that mean now, Lord? Are we supposed to stay here or what? But it was like God closed a chapter. It was the end of that chapter of the book, and God said, no, it's time to move on. I brought you to this place that I showed you, because you needed to come here to end this chapter. You needed this place to aim for, this vision to hang on to keep your hope up and to keep you going. And so I've brought you here so that you would feel like it had happened and it had finished, and now it's time to move on. Within a few weeks, God had arranged a place for us to live back on the mainland and a job for Rob. So we moved back onto the land, not onto the main part of the island, not really knowing what was going to happen next. Now, our desire for a place of our own had always been there, and it came back more strongly than ever. It seemed like, okay, we've been on this journey, God's finished that chapter, we're out of debt, we still don't have a property of our own, and we so long to be settled somewhere. With 5 kids and moving around a lot, you just can't save money for a deposit, and we were no closer now than we had been 7 years earlier to owning our own home. In fact, I got to the point where I was really quite upset about it. I went out into the paddock one day and sat down amongst the goats, and I had myself a real old pity party. Oh God, it's not fair. We never seem to be able to get our own home. There's nothing we can do about it. It's just not fair. But I got past that. In fact, I got to the point where I completely surrendered to God. I realised that we were living in a great place. We were in a 6-bedroom home on 5 acres looking out over water. And Rob had a job, and I got to the point where I was totally content. And I knew, Lord, if you want us to stay here for a long time, we can do that. I can be content, and it's just fine. If you want us to have a home of our own, great. And if you don't, that's okay. And I was honestly and truly completely surrendered of that issue. Sometimes it seems to be the funny thing about God. He waits till you're completely surrendered to him on an issue, and then he moves. Shortly after I'd given up any hope of ever owning our own home, we were visited by Rob's mother. She said to us that she would like to help us buy a property, to help us get a start, that she would put in some and we would mortgage the rest. The only problem was she had all of her money tied up in a property she already owned with Rob's older brother, who was showing no inclination to buy her out at that stage, so it would probably be 2 or 3 years before she could do it, but she'd like us just to think on it. While she was visiting, we thought we'd show her around the area so she'd have some idea of the kind of places we were talking about in the future, because she normally lived in the North Island. Also, Rob's uncle and aunt had visited us earlier, just before she'd come, and his uncle used to be a real estate agent. He'd looked around at Nelson area where we were and said to Rob's mum, if you want to invest down there, you want to do it sooner, not later, because the prices are starting to climb and they're going to go really high. To cut a long story short, when Rob's mum was there, we went and looked at this one property, and they just Well, we all just fell instantly in love with it. It was gorgeous. 17 acres, 4-bedroom house, beautiful native bush as you came into the property, highly productive land, and a sunny, warm house with carved wood, stained glass windows in the kitchen with New Zealand's native wood pigeons on them. It was just lovely. But it was way outside our price range, and none of us had any money. I mean, we didn't have 2 cents to rub together, and all her money was tied up. But to cut a long story short, God just opened all the doors, and within 3 months we were actually moving onto that property, the proud new owners of it. Rob's mum was able to get her money out of the other property. She put in half in cash, and we mortgaged half of this property. The plan was for us to actually build a little cottage or something similar for her to live in, but to start with we all stayed together in the 4-bedroom house. However, none of us had enough money left to build the extra cottage, and after a while it became obvious that we all needed our own space. After much prayer and consideration, we finally decided perhaps it would be best if we sold this property, brought one with a bit less land, and brought in but with something with 2 houses. So we put our house on the market. Now God sold it, and it was just amazing. In the 14 months that we'd owned it, the value of the property had risen dramatically, and we sold it for over $200,000 more than we'd purchased it for 14 months earlier. By the time we paid off the expenses and split the difference, Rob and I walked away with $80,000 cash that we hadn't had beforehand. God was just amazing. In the end, rather than buy another property close by, Rob and I felt God calling us to go to a place called Greymouth on the west coast of the South Island. And we purchased a house there, just a house in section, but surrounded by a lot of rural land and fields and forestry. Rob's mum didn't want to come to that part of the South Island, so she decided she'd get a house bus, go back to the North Island to visit with her elderly mother for a while, and then return to the Nelson area and buy a home there. What we didn't know at the time was that she had cancer. After she went back up north, she had a fall and hurt her hip, and when they started to do explorations, as it didn't seem to get better, they discovered she had secondary cancer in her groin and primary cancer in her lungs. 3 months later, she was dead. If we hadn't sold the property when we did, of course we would have looked after her, but we would have had our finances all entangled with her estate, and it would have been a really awkward situation. So God had the timing of that right down to the last little bit that it really worked out. However, of course, it was very hard for Rob that his mum was ill and dying in the upper part of the country while we were down in Greymouth. Now, Greymouth was a lovely place, a small town, but things actually got quite stressful for us there. Rob worked at a hospital as a caregiver and an orderly, and he was really good at it. But he worked a whole bunch of shifts. Every week he would do 1 day shift, 2 afternoon shifts, and 2 night shifts. Both of our sleep patterns were completely disturbed. We'd put the children into school when we went down there temporarily, because when we moved I knew that I was going to be having some fairly dramatic surgery and that I was going to be on my back for 3 months unable to really do anything. So it didn't seem like a great time to be trying to set up homeschooling the children again. They had in fact been in some of them had been in a small Christian school for the last year or so since we moved back in from the Marlborough Sounds, because I had been just quite burnt out with the whole schooling thing when we moved back in. So we decided to try this little local Christian school, and now we were moving. I wanted to homeschool again, but felt that this was a bad time to try and do it. And where we were moving to, there was a little country school right across the road from our house, only 40 students, so we thought, well, maybe that's the answer for a while. So we enrolled some of the children in school. One was not yet school aged, but that turned out to be quite a dreadful experience. There was a lot of bullying, a lot of issues, and it all added up to an awful lot of stress. I did have my surgery. In fact, I ended up having 2 lots of different surgeries. And by the time we combined grieving over Rob's mum, the lack of sleep from the sleep patterns, the stress of the school situation, my health and recovery from the surgeries, I had just got so stressed out. And I didn't realise it, but I was getting depressed again. I didn't sleep. Everywhere I turned, it seemed that there was things just needing my attention, things that urgently needed doing, and I just didn't have the time or the energy to do them. It got to the point where every morning I would get up and I would just mentally put aside all those things that were screaming for my attention, and I would just put one foot in front of the other all day long, doing the basics of what needed doing the cooking, doing the laundry, dealing with the kids' schooling, because we'd pulled them back out of that school because the situation was so bad, and I was homeschooling again. Just getting through the day, one thing at a time. At night time, I would crash into bed totally exhausted, but as soon as my body stopped moving, my brain started going, and these thoughts would just come. Have you paid the power bill? Oh, you haven't ironed Rob's uniform for tomorrow. Oh, this needs doing, that needs doing. Have you done this? And with these thoughts would come a rising sense of panic. My heart would beat faster, my whole body would tense up, worrying about all these things, and I just couldn't get to sleep. In the end, I went nearly 5 months with almost no sleep, and of course I was pretty much a wreck by then. I wasn't coping, my house was a disaster, and I could see no way to get out of this situation. One day I went to visit the nurse at the local doctor's clinic for a completely unrelated matter, but while I was there, suddenly I just started talking about how life was going and how I was feeling, and I started to cry, and I used up a lot of her tissues, and I really unburdened myself, and I said to her, it feels like I'm on a roller coaster or a merry-go-round, and it's just going around and around and around, and I just want it to stop so I can get off, but I don't know how to make it stop. It just won't stop. That dear nurse listened patiently to my story, and she said, you really need to see the doctor. I said, I can't even afford to see the doctor. Despite the fact that we had made money on the last house and invested it now in a home of our own, that gave us our deposit, we still didn't have any extra cash, and our day-to-day finances still were pretty tight. But she said, look, that doesn't matter. It's more important that you get help. So I was able to go and see the doctor without there being a charge, and as I described to him my situation, I also described the symptoms I'd been having. You see, I'd begun to think there was something wrong with my heart, because I had started to have these heart palpitations. Just out of the blue, suddenly my heart would skip a beat, and then it would race into overdrive, and I wouldn't be able to breathe. I was having trouble catching my breath, and it was so frightening. The first time it happened, I thought I was having a heart attack. But then it kind of passed, and slowly my breathing returned, and it was okay. And then it would happen every now and then. My heart would skip a beat and then just take off, and I'd struggle for breath, and it was really scary. And it didn't just happen when I was exerting myself or anything like that. I could be just sitting at the table quietly having a cup of tea, and suddenly it would happen. And it had gone from happening occasionally to the point where some afternoons it would happen every few minutes for hours at a time. And that was really scaring me. What was wrong with my heart? Well, the doctor explained to me that what I was experiencing is what's known as panic attacks. Basically, when you have a lot of stress going on and you don't deal with that stress, you internalise it, and eventually your body can't take it anymore, and it starts to develop psychosomatic symptoms. And these panic attacks or heart palpitations were one symptom of the stress that I had built up in my body. Other things like insomnia and even cancer can develop from not dealing with the stresses in your life. Stress is actually something that can be really, really bad for you. He explained to me also that the lack of sleep was one of my big problems, and that when you don't sleep, your body is not able to produce the neurotransmitters that it needs. Neurotransmitters are a little thing in your brain that you use a lot of during the day, especially when you're thinking about something or making decisions. And it's a bit like having a bank account. If you don't build up enough neurotransmitters as you sleep and as you rest to use during the day, then when you work and do things during the day and make decisions, you use more than you've got, and eventually it's like a bank account that becomes overdrawn, and sooner or later your mind forecloses. I'd got to the point where I was way overdrawn. I couldn't think straight. I couldn't make simple decisions about what needed to be done. What was for dinner, that was just even too hard a decision to make a lot of the time. So I really needed to get some sleep. The doctor wanted to put me on antidepressants, but I really wasn't very keen on that idea. I said to him, I just need to get some sleep. If you could just give me something to help me sleep. And when I'd been in hospital for surgery, they'd used a very mild sleeping tablet on me to help me relax, because I'm a very light sleeper and knew I wouldn't sleep in the hospital ward without some help. So I said, could I have some of those? I just need some sleep. So he finally agreed that he'd give me enough sleeping tablets to last me for 1 month, and on the condition that I'd come back to him after 4 weeks, and that if I wasn't any better, that at that point he would put me on antidepressants. So I went home, once again armed with the knowledge of what was wrong with me. You'd think I would have realised sooner. After all, I'd been through this before, but I was just so shattered, so totally sleep deprived, that I hadn't even realised what was going on. Well, 3 days of good sleep later, or 3 nights rather, of good sleep later, I started to seek the Lord as to what I should do. Lord, okay, I've got myself back into this pit. How do I get out of it? And the Lord started to help me and to show me different things. One of the first things that he brought to my attention was a wonderful system called Fly Lady. You can look that up on the internet, www.flylady.com. Flylady has this wonderful system, and she gave me exactly what I'd needed my whole married life and never had. Someone to take me by the hand and show me step by step what to do to get my house under control and get rid of the chaos that was going on all around me. And she dealt with more than just housework. She helped me to get my thinking straight as well. So I started using this Flylady system, and no, my house didn't become immaculate overnight. What happened though is that I started to see the light at the end of the tunnel. I knew there was a plan. I knew what to do next. I knew that eventually it would all come together, and that helped me feel so much more hopeful. I also joined a support group on the internet for homeschoolers who use Flylady, and within a very short time I was actually running the group, and it was really neat to be able to give and receive mutual support, and that made such a difference. In fact, just the other day as I was putting together this material, Rob came in and said, I just heard something on the radio. It was a lady talking about depression, and she said that according to research, those women who have daily contact with a support person are 75% more likely to overcome depression. And that doesn't mean a support person that you talk to about your depression. It just means daily contact with someone with whom you can relate, someone you can trust, someone you can talk to who understands where you're at and where you're coming from. And I think that was a big factor in my own recovery from depression, was the fact that I had that support. You see, one of the big factors too in my becoming depressed was that I had been so isolated. Not only isolated by the fact that we moved around so much, but the biggest thing that had kept me isolated was my own pride, though I had no idea at the time. You see, all my life I'd heard things like, Cynthia, you're so organised. Wow, give it to Cynthia to do. She's amazing. You're a super mum. You're a superwoman. How do you do it all? I'd heard these things all my life, and I had this weird, false sense that I had to somehow keep up appearances. If someone was coming to my house, I would clean in a frenzy so that no one ever saw my house any less than perfect, despite the fact that 99% of the time it looked like a tornado had just been through it. I didn't want anyone to know that I couldn't cope. I'd offer to look after other people's children when they needed a break, but I couldn't ring someone up and say, hey, I'm going crazy here, could you take the kids for a couple of hours? I just couldn't do it. Somehow I had this idea that if I didn't appear to be the perfect mum, the perfect person, that I couldn't cope with things, that as a homeschooler, as a Christian, I would be a bad witness. No one would want to have a big family, no one would want to homeschool, no one would want to be a Christian if it looked like my life wasn't all that it should be. I felt somehow that if people saw what I was really like and how often I completely fluffed things, that they just wouldn't want any part of those things. And that was really a false idea. God is bigger than that. Throughout the Bible we read stories of people's triumphing in God, but we also read the reality of the fact that they are human and that they muck things up on a regular basis. There is no perfect person, there is no superwoman, and you sure as heck don't have to be her, and neither do I. If you have a concept in your mind that you have to do everything right and that you can't let people see who you really are and what you're really like, well, let go of that, because it's just not true. Do you remember the verse in the Bible in Matthew chapter 6 where Jesus says, come unto me all ye who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest? And it tells us to learn from him, and that his yoke is easy and his burden is light. When we take on that burden of having to be perfect and to keep up appearances, we're taking on a very heavy yoke, one that none of us can stand up under for long, and one that Jesus never intended for us to take on. We need to learn from him. We need to be humble, just as he is humble, and realise that we don't have to appear perfect. A while back I was talking to a friend who happens to be a doctor himself, and he was suffering from seasonal depression, and he was in a pretty bad way. And I described to him what depression felt like to me, and it seemed that it really helped him to hear how it seemed, the image I had of depression. So I'd like to share that with you. Being depressed is like being in a big, deep, dark pit. You can sort of see a glimmer of light somewhere way up overhead, but it's so far away and there's no way to get to it. And it feels like the walls are closing in around you. The walls are all those things demanding your attention, all those things you think you should have done but haven't, those things you can't cope with, those decisions you can't make. Those are those slippery walls, and they're just closing in around you. Recovering from depression is a process of trying to climb out of the pit. And usually when you first start climbing, you feel like you've made a little bit of progress. It's slow, but you're kind of getting a toehold. And then some little circumstance comes along, or somebody comes along and says something, and it just knocks you right back to the bottom of the pit, and it feels totally hopeless. But as you begin to recover, you get stronger, you learn ways of coping, and you begin to climb with a bit more effect. And that light at the at the top starts to get a little bit closer. And eventually, as you recover more, it seems like the walls shrink, and soon, before you even know it, you're out of the pit and you've left it far behind. The problem is, there's always other pits, and you have to learn to recognise your own danger signs, because if you don't, you'll end up falling right back into a pit all over again. And I had to learn too. I had to learn all over again what I can cope with, what I can't cope with, when to say no, when to just back off, when to allow myself to feel pain and fear and fright, and when to pour my heart out to God. I had to learn that it was okay not to be able to do everything. I see some homeschooling mums out there, and boy, they're like, I don't know, they have so much energy, they do all these things, their kids go to this and they go to that and they do this and they do that. I can't cope with that kind of lifestyle, and I used to feel really guilty that I didn't allow my children to do all these extra things. But the reality is, God made me the way I am, and I can't cope with too many things crammed into my life, and that is okay. Now, I got over that depression much better the second time than I did the first, even though the first seemed like I had recovered completely. But I hadn't had the support after that first time that I had after the second time, and that really did make a huge difference. Not long after I got over this depression, we felt God telling us to sell our house in Greymouth and move back to the North Island. Now, that's something we had never expected. We felt that the South Island was home and that the North Island was that horrible place we'd left, and we were never going back there. But God seemed to be saying, you need to be closer to family, you're going to the North Island. And Rob started looking at doing a university degree course that was based in the lower part of the North Island, so we purchased a home close to where that was. At first we thought we had several months to do this, because the course wasn't due to start till the following February, and this was May. But we felt after a while that God was telling us no, it was urgent, we needed to move urgently. So we kind of got ready to move, and then we thought, well, Lord, we really don't want to pay the real estate agents locally lots of commission to sell our house, because we didn't feel like they did a very good job. And if you want us to move quickly, Lord, I guess you'll take care of it. So what we're going to do is we're going to advertise our house privately in the newspaper, and if you want us to move soon, then you'll sell it quickly. Now, houses in Greymouth don't sell very quickly ordinarily, and our house was probably well, it was a very unique house for a start, which gave it a limited market, and it was kind of in the upper price range end for general houses in Greymouth. So, normally you wouldn't expect it to sell very quickly. Well, we advertised it in the newspaper. 2 hours after the ad came out, we'd sold our house. I guess you want us to move soon, Lord. So we packed up everything, made all the arrangements, moved to the North Island. Within 5 days of arriving here, a whole series of disasters started to happen in our extended family. First, one of my young brothers was killed in a tragic car accident, and a couple of weeks after that, my mother was knocked off a bicycle in another accident. She broke her neck and is now tetraplegic. Not long after that, Rob's grandmother passed away, and then my father was diagnosed with cancer. So really, we were in our new home for less than a week before we were set off all over the countryside, ministering to family and helping them. And it was such a blessing to actually be back here in the North Island, so that we had access to travelling to help our family and support them. If we'd still been in the South Island, that would have just been financially impossible for us. For 6 months, we were all over the place, and Rob wasn't able to find a job. We'd planned on moving up here and Rob getting a job fairly quickly. We sort of had enough money aside for a couple of weeks or a month, and that would have been fine. But Rob wasn't able to get a job straight away, because every time he came close to applying for one, some other disaster would strike and we'd be off somewhere else again. But God provided our needs despite the fact we had no income for 6 months. And all through all these things that happened, I did not suffer depression again, which, under normal circumstances, if these things had happened the year before when I was depressed, I wouldn't have coped. I would have been a total basket case. But God was sustaining me, and He taught me when to back off, when to, that I just couldn't do everything, and that was okay, and to make sure that I got some sleep when I needed it, to recognise the triggers that make me depressed. And I could also see God's hand in our family moving in glorious ways that were bringing the extended family, most of whom aren't Christians, closer to Him. And I know that God is still working there, so that was really neat. Also, through the moves that we have made, from selling our house in Auckland, and then from having the house in Nelson and then in Greymouth and so forth, we now have more equity in our home than the entire amount of the home that we gave up in Auckland. God has been so gracious, He's restored to us what we gave up in following Him. God loves you. He loves each one of you. You don't have to be some sort of super mum. You don't have to be some great hero of the faith for God to want to be intimately involved in your life. He wants to be with you and walk with you each step of the way, and you can totally rely on Him and trust Him to provide your needs. It's okay to go through trials. It's okay to have hard times, but God is there, and if you will reach out to Him, He will help you. If you are suffering from depression or think you might be, or anyone you know is, please don't ignore it and hope it will just go away, because generally it doesn't. Sometimes depression, or real depression, involves a chemical imbalance in the brain, and sometimes that needs to be addressed with some medication. You wouldn't deny a diabetic or a heart patient medication to help them, even though that might not be the whole solution. So don't think that just because you're a Christian you can't have medication for depression. For me, one of the things I have to always be careful of is lack of sleep. I have discovered that when I'm stressed, I just don't sleep very well. I can cope with that occasionally, but if it goes on for a long time, I'm in trouble. Also, it seems to be hormonal for me. There's 2 or 3 days in my cycle just before my period starts every month where I just do not sleep very well. And I've found that sometimes that's okay, it's just those 2 days and then I'm back to a regular sleep pattern. But sometimes for some reason it just drags over and I end up just really not sleeping and getting very stressed. I'm not a person who likes medication or anything like that, but I have come to a point where I realise that it is more important that I get some sleep when I need it than that I maintain this brave front of not taking meds and all that kind of thing. So now, if I don't sleep for a couple of nights, I'm no longer afraid to take half a tablet or something just to help me get to sleep, because I know that in the end I need that sleep to be able to meet the needs of my family and to function every day. One of the scriptures that's come to mean the very most to me is this, Proverbs 3 verses 5 and 6. Trust in the Lord with all of your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths. And to me that means not just trusting God with everyday circumstances, but being able to come to him when things are not going well for you, and being able to lay it out before him, and then being able to trust that he will direct your paths to the answers. So today I want to really encourage you to do that. No matter what is happening in your life, whether it's positive or negative, whatever's going on, come to the Lord all the time, lay it all out before him, and then just wait for him and trust him to direct your paths. May the Lord richly bless you. Thanks for listening to me today. Bye.
The music provided tonight comes from the Podshow Podsafe Music Network. Check it out today at music.podshow.com. The music you heard on this show comes from Highest Praise Productions, which produces and publishes modern worship, praise, and instrumental music from various artists and writers. Because their publishing company owns the rights to their music, they are able to release pod-safe music for increased exposure to the masses. Check out more of their music at www.highestpraise.com. And don't forget, while you're online, to check out our website, cindyrushton.com, and momtomomradioshow.com. See you there.